Good afternoon. The Second World War began in September 1939. France fell quite quickly, and England stood alone for quite a long period of time. The Luftwaffe attacked the fighter airfields and then London itself. Churchill uttered the words that one commentator said, what was it? He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. The doodlebugs came. The British Army was surrounded at Dunkirk. And we weren't there. We did not enter the war for more than 2 years when finally we were pushed into it at Pearl Harbor, as you know. Roosevelt couldn't act without the nation behind him, and we weren't behind him until that made it impossible for us to behave otherwise. We weren't there, Barbara was. And she has observed and remembered. She was in her late teens, early adolescence, 11, 12, 13, in those years, and she observed and remembered. She has written about it quite beautifully, and today she's going to tell us about it. Barbara, tell us what it was like there and then.
Good afternoon. There are many ways to start this story, but I'm going to begin just very simply. We had neighbors in the 1930s called the Ludwigs, who were refugees from Sudetenland, which had been occupied by the Germans along with Czechoslovakia. And so with them, as children, we would listen to, on the radio or the wireless, we would listen to Hitler's speeches, which they would translate. So my mother was well informed about what was actually going on. So in 1938, there were great attempts for appeasement, and Neville Chamberlain went to Germany, and at the same time, my mother decided that she was ahead of the game. She didn't see that appeasement was going to happen, so she arranged to drive us to Cornwall, my sister and I. So we drove to Cornwall, and the map is there to give you an idea just of the size of distances in 1938. They haven't changed. Well, you sit tight. I may get the story right. We started just outside London. So I'm going to give you a rough idea so that I'll give it to you now. I didn't know when I was going to give it to you. Remember that England fitted into, am I working? Is that better? Oh, much better. Good. England will fit into California 2 times, and it will fit into Texas 3. The distances for traveling in England were enormous. The roads were simple roads. We had no freeways. No one did. And the traffic and the speed limit was 30 miles an hour. So you can imagine that from my little home, which was in a village, a small village, 20 miles south of London, and that same village was only 40 miles from Dover, and the distance between Dover and France is just 21 miles. So think about your trips to Everett and Renton, and know that those journeys for us took hours. We didn't have straight roads. So the wisdom my mother had, we drove to Cornwall 2 days later Chamberlain came back from Berlin and he said, "Peace in our time." So England settled in for a few more months. My mother was absolutely certain and responded to the words from the government, which were organizing the whole country and giving them a fair warning. All able people should begin to be prepared to do war work, that they should be prepared that for all children from major towns and larger cities should be sent along with the elderly, the infirm, the sick, and the insane, so that they would not be hampering the activities which were vitally going to be needed among the population to do the war work as the soldiers were being drawn into the army, the navy, and the air force. So we're back from Cornwall, and we are, to make my mother's life manageable, she had volunteered to be an ambulance driver. My father had business in London, and he was also a very busy home guard in the activities, and they felt comfortable that we were in boarding school. Well, one day in June in 1940, the Blitz had begun on England. My little village, south of London, was on the main path, and so my mother was very busy driving ambulances and taking care. We were also surrounded by small Spitfire aerodromes who were in the defense. It was chaotic. It was overwhelming. And so one day, as we were in the in our boarding school, a bomb fell in the driveway from a stray bomb. It did not explode. And so the school closed, as they said, for the rest of the war. The headmistress, Miss Corley, made arrangements. And now I'm going to read more because I wrote about it better than I can say it. Within 48 hours, our school was closed for the duration. Our hurried plans were made by the school and our parents to evacuate us to Somerset in the West Country far from London, where it was hoped we would be safe. Our temporary headquarters would be the home of the parents of the headmistress, Miss Corley, and what she had and our parents were faced with immediately was the beginning of the unknown. There was a part of the evacuation journey on the train that I remember vividly during this abrupt transition from pampered childhood to privileged abandonment. We must have looked angelic standing on the platform of the Waterloo London station, a well-chaperoned crowd among thousands of children also with tags and gas masks around their shoulders, all being evacuated to different parts of the country, some privately, some by the government itself, and that was a whole organization which I don't think I'll go into right now. So we settled ourselves in the train, our gas masks sat in a row on the luggage rack above us, along with the willow hampers filled with lunch sandwiches, which the school kitchen had packed for that morning. Some were still clutching teddy bears and favorite toys as we sat crowded into two adjacent compartments. The corridor train, steam train, puffed its way through the bucolic scenes of familiar countryside. Having said goodbye to our parents, who had indicated nothing to alarm us and hoped to see us again soon, We were nevertheless quite aware that our little world would be very different from now on. We knew that France, Belgium, and Holland had recently fallen to the Germans, and that Britain's sailors were stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, where an evacuation very different from ours was going on. An urgent appeal by the BBC had asked the unimaginable. Would anyone with a boat, anything that floated, please take to the English Channel to help rescue our men from the French beaches where they were trapped between the German army and the sea? A couple of hours out of London, our train stopped at Portsmouth Station. Before the guard could blow his whistle and wave his green flag to signal the engineman to start up the train again, there was a sudden influx of extra passengers, and a ragged assortment of men catapulted into our midst. As the train started off, puffing billows of steam, as far as we could see down the length of the corridors, there were soldiers, it seemed, like hundreds, in sweaty, stained, and torn khaki uniforms, all unshaven, weather-beaten, sunken-eyed. They seemed to have a look beyond exhaustion, with fleeting expressions of relief as they wedged themselves against the side of the corridors and the doorways, sliding to rest on the floor. Miss Corley nodded at us and made it perfectly clear as she stood that we should sit and offer our seats to the soldiers. Girls, she said, these young men have just come back from Dunkirk. Let's try to make them comfortable. Without a second thought, we made way for them in our compartments, and some of us took their places in the crowded corridor. As if dead on their feet, the men hesitated as we offered our seats, then sank slowly into the now empty places, seeming unfamiliar with bending their knees even. They sat and gazed at us. Some looked far away for a moment with tears in their eyes. I have a daughter about your age, one freckle-haired, sandy-haired soldier said. He reached out and touched my hand. Some of the men just closed their eyes and fell asleep immediately, deeply, only to wake with a sudden jerk. As far as children could see, every inch of the length of the train, was now covered with sleeping men. The sooty smell of the train mingled with the odor of sweat, quite different from the soap and cologne smell of our fathers. Later, we were to learn that these soldiers and thousands more had waded out to the motley rescue fleet as it approached the beaches, clambering into whichever vessel had room for more than one person. Large and small sailboats, crab boats, even rowing boats, pleasure steamers, big tugboats, all shapes, sizes, vintages, and conditions, bobbed too safely to the shore for safety. This ragtag fleet was just part of the armada that had managed to find its way through the wrecks and minefields. They had sailed across the English Channel, 21 miles at its narrowest point, throughout the night without navigation lights. Some of the boats were never meant for such a journey, or even to leave the safety of a river or a harbor. Their mobilization had been so urgent that there had been no time to provision with food or water, and certainly not to take up any space with life jackets. Time was short. Eventually we all settled down. Miss Corley reached up to the luggage rack and brought down the baskets of egg and cress sandwiches, sponge cake, and other picnic favorites. It was implicit we would share what we had with our new companions. At first, she was at a loss to know what to offer them for water, because the only water available on the train that day was from the engine's cooling system and was to be used to flush the toilets only. All we had was lemon barley, which was a very rich, sweet, delicious, but undrinkable cordial. The men, revived after their brief naps, appeared less hungry than thirsty as we spread the feast in front of them. Parched and pleading for even the concentrated cordial to quench their thirst. To our amazement, they gulped it down straight from the bottle. "We've only had seawater to drink," the sandy-haired soldier said. Nor had they eaten, washed, or slept for endless days, as they had hidden in the shadow of the cliffs above Dunkirk's beaches, and still alive. By the time we arrived in Southampton, their assembly station, we felt we were saying goodbye to friends. We settled back into our seats in the carriage and talked with Miss Corley about this most unexpected time we had shared with strangers who had brought us a little closer to the war. So we arrived in Somerset, and we stayed in the small house which belonged to Miss Corley's family. We slept on the floor for a few days, and we had lessons just to keep us busy. In a week or two, they had found a lovely big old Queen Anne mansion vicarage with plenty of room for all of us. And we moved in there, settled in, and we became a source of curiosity to the farming children around. We were in beautiful bucolic farming land, and the word had gone around that we were the evaporees from London. My mother and father, in the meantime, are still safely at home in the little village, and we settle into a lovely life, a little school. We become part of the farming community, and we're invited to the harvesting. We also find our way down to the blacksmith and see him shoeing horses. We see the delivery of milk to be taken to the big cities in huge urns. Life was very simple. So all of this seemed like the perfect summer holiday we were on without our parents. But one day, a stray aeroplane, Luftwaffe, strayed way off course, dropped a bomb in a neighboring field, and killed a cow. Coed Bell closed forever after that. We all went back to our homes in and around London by train. My mother and father had to work very hard to decide what we were going to do next. And my father's brother, my uncle, and his family offered to take us in, and they lived in a little house on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, about 20 miles from Sheffield. So a friend of my mother's, who was also an ambulance driver, agreed that, offered to drive us. She had a car, and so she drove us from Petswood, which is south of London, to Sheffield, and that is something like, the distance from home to Somerset was 135 miles. The distance to Yorkshire from home was 165 miles north. We arrived, and we saw my aunt and uncle and my cousin for the first time, and we settled in, and and we were enrolled in the old-fashioned village one-room school, and this was a very different world. We had been in a girls' school in the south of England. We were now in part of the country where even the language and its dialect sounded different. And we were among country people, and they were lovely. But like for the Somerset people, we were a novelty. So one day, the headmaster decided to introduce us to the children in the classroom. There were the 4 classes in the 4 corners, and a stove in each corner, and 1 blackboard. And so he said, now, just want you to know, and I really can't do this in Yorkshire dialect anymore, but I used to be able to. These young girls are from London, and listen to them speak. And they made us read from a book. And when we finished, he said, and now that is what London King's English sounds like. The children were lovely. They taught us their games. We played games that we didn't play in the South. They played with hoops and sticks. They had whipped tops. They walked on tin cans with strings. We had for drink something we'd never heard of before, but is delicious, called dandelion and burdock. You will never have heard of that. And so we really had a lovely time. My mother came that following Christmas, just a few months after we had been there. She couldn't understand a word we said. We had picked up the dialect so thoroughly. So that Christmas, she decided that we weren't learning quite the kinds of things that were going to be useful for children in the South to know. The children in Yorkshire were being taught they were the children of shepherds, they were the children of steel workers, they were the children of domestic workers, they were the children of merchants. They were living a life that didn't really translate to the South, so my mother transferred us to another school. By this time, that was our fourth school. And it was awful. The girls were not friendly. And the math teacher knew that I was really bad at maths, so she ignored anybody who wasn't good at math and just taught the 2 girls in the front row to shine. So living on the edge of the moors was a whole other experience. We were just 10 miles from Sheffield, which you may or may not know is and was the capital of steel. They're famous for Sheffield steel. And sooner or later became the target of the Luftwaffe. They had, as I understand it, to disguise their furnaces, which obviously would glow into the light, it was very difficult for them to be camouflaged. The Luftwaffe found its way, and they had 2 nights of terrible blitz. We felt and heard it, but we were in no danger whatsoever. But the water system of the whole of the region was completely destroyed, and so there were great difficulties, but if you know anything about the English, we kept going. My mother and father at this stage were still incredibly involved in their war work, and the decision was made probably by letter. I'm not sure. I only saw my mother twice when we lived there for 2 years. It was decided that it was safe enough to leave us there, and so I've told you most of what was going on. After 2 years, my uncle's house really and truly was getting a little bit too small to have 2 extra teenagers or potential teenagers, and so my mother agreed that it was time to move us once more. And through a friend of the family, she discovered that there was a convent boarding school in North Wales, and maybe by telephone she contacted them, I really don't know, or whether it was done by mail, I don't know. But they grudgingly agreed that they would accept us mid-term. So my mother and her friend who had the car got enough petrol and decided that they would come and take time off and drive us from Sheffield to North Wales, which is about, from London, it's 247 miles. From Yorkshire, it was something like 120. So we drive. It's late autumn, cold, dark, not anybody's favorite season, and we arrive very early in a dark, wet, windy afternoon. And the first thing we see are these really tall walls, and behind it a very forbidding-looking building. And in the driveway, as they saw us coming through, were a number of people in black flapping clothes with white tunnels around their faces. We knew nothing about nuns, we knew nothing about the Catholic religion, and so we were launched. You think it's funny. It was terrifying. So we were enrolled, we were included in school, and for a while my sister and I were given a little room off the dormitory to share. But she was 4 years younger than I and really needed far more nurturing than I did. I am now about 12, so she is only 8. She is the one who really suffered the most. So I moved into the dormitory, and I don't know if anybody here has ever been in a boarding school where the dormitory is one room with white curtains around each bed and a wash basin and a ewer is how you wash. There's no running water. And one night I am going to bed early when I first moved into the dormitory, and I have pulled my curtains around and I get into bed, and it is an apple pie bed, which you call short sheeting, and it's wet. And I knew just instinctively that I was on test, that I must not make a noise, I must not complain, I must not ask for help. And so eventually I unmade the bed, got into the bed and slept. So that was some kind of a welcome. The rest of the time was, and we were there nearly 2 years. The rest of the time it felt lonely, it felt cold, we were hungry, we wanted to run away, the nuns were not friendly. The chapel now, for a little girl coming from a village and not a church-going family, it is fascinating to be expected to go to chapel at 6 o'clock in the morning, rosary, morning prayers, afternoon prayers, rosary, and evening prayers every single day. They had all kinds of rituals that made no sense to us at all, but they tolerated us, so we tolerated them. So then there is, in 1944, a lull in the war. My mother has suffered equally, not having the care and protection of her own children, and she knew that we were really unhappy. She and my father had written to us regularly, once or twice a week. They would send us whatever they could spare from their rations. My mother made an absolutely wicked orange cake, and she would scrounge butter and eggs and send it to us. But a lull in the war came in 1944. The Germans were distracted in Italy and northern Africa, and so my mother decided to bring us home. So she and her friend took the car again and scrounged petrol and came up to fetch us and take us home. I'm now nearly 15. One day, and so in addition to that, we are enrolled in yet one more school. I think that's probably my 5th. And the nuns are nice. It's a convent. The nuns are nice, and the life picks up reasonably well, but we're all strangers. We haven't lived together for so many years, and my mother has in front of her 2 tricky teenagers. So one day, my mother calls me to come and look out of the window, and she points out that across the sky is moving a very noisy, pencil-like looking thing. She said, that, we have just been told, is a pilotless bomb. They call it a V1. We're calling it a doodlebug. And she said, when the engine stops, it will fall and it will explode. So whenever you see one, make sure that you go for the shelter. We had an indoor shelter which looked like a table tennis table, and we slept underneath it. There was metal wiring around the outside and blankets against the dust, against the draft. And she said, go for the shelter. So we all knew what that was all about. We were prepared. So life went on. We went to school. I came back from school one afternoon, and I was just getting a snack before doing my homework, and my mother was going on at me about something, and we heard a doodlebug, and it was very close, and the engine stopped. We didn't have time to go to the shelter, which was in the sitting room, and it exploded in my back garden. Doors and windows and furniture and walls and dust just floated in the air. I didn't hear any sound. The explosion was so enormous. It was just blast. Next thing I knew, I was out on the lawn, and I had a dog in my arms, so I'd obviously found her. And my mother was out on the lawn, and we looked at each other and just laughed because we looked so strange, just covered in dust. In the meantime, my little sister had been in the village, and we learned later that she was absolutely frantic because she was not allowed to come down to get home because she was so young, and they were afraid for what she might find. No one was killed. My mother's lungs were deflated, and it was a milling throng of people. When a bomb falls, people reach out. A friend of my father's suddenly appeared. He lived on the other side of the village. He appeared, and he said, come to my home when you're ready, and we will give you bed and comfort for as long as you need it. My father had fallen asleep on the train. He was tired, and he had slept, and he had slept onto the other station, so he was walking home and safe. So he turned up, and my little sister turned up being escorted by one of the air raid wardens. So we were taken care of by Jock Webster's family for several days, probably weeks, I don't know how long. And in that time, my mother and father had decided that the only place they knew was far enough away that they had an idea of what was there was back to North Wales. So, with my mother's friend, who was a very good friend by this time, offered to drive us all the way to North Wales, this time taking my mother with us because she really had invisible injury. I've no idea how, when, or if she received medical attention, but obviously she managed. So we drove back to Wales. We found, first of all, a temporary place. Then we found a boarding house who would take us in. And I really don't remember much about the time we spent there, whether it was weeks. It certainly was much more than days. But we were exhausted, traumatized, in no shape. How did I describe it? I had nightmares. My nightmare was that I would open a door and I would fall endlessly. My sister was distressed and cried bitterly. We were barely managing, barely functional, but we returned home and we were a family again. We didn't know each other, but that is how family regathers. The future was bleak. The war was still on. My only possibility was there was no future for me academically because I had so little consistent education. It was decided that I would be sent to a commercial college and learn to be a shorthand typist. So while I'm there, I also we stayed in touch with the school, and one of the nuns suggested that it would be good therapy for me to have something to do, and so a job was found for me clerking in the Ministry of Education in London, where they had what do they call it? Where they had commandeered many of the large houses in Belgravia, and the Board of Education clerk's office was in the attics of one of these lovely old mansions. So I was able to function, and I took the train, and I would go to work every day. And it was useful because I was making a contribution to my family as well. One day I'm wandering around, probably on my way back to London Bridge Station, and I am crossing Eaton Square, and suddenly I find myself lifted into the air and thrown against a wall, and then came a huge explosion. This was the V2, and it did far more damage than the other V1. So I'm unhurt, I'm surprised, I'm shaken, and I go home, and that's the end of my London adventure.
It was a very different missile, wasn't it?
Very different. It was huge. It was a huge. I don't even know how it was. Do you know how it was projected? I have no idea.
But it's very similar to our missiles now, rather than the doodlebug.
Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's very helpful. I've never known. So finally, in 1945, victory in Europe. And for that, how would I say? I would thank you all, Grant, Linda, and Nancy, and Risa, for giving me this opportunity to revisit a world that is seared into my memory. I have my own video, which I can call on any time. So this is the first time I've had a chance to tell it for 15 years. So thank you for that.
I want to say that we are uniquely fortunate. Very few people, I would think, have the opportunity to hear the story of the war in the intimacy that you've projected for us. Thank you.
Well, I also want to tell you some other things that I have found about myself, and that is, it reminded me again of how many people have made my life possible. The other one is that at 96, I'm forever aware of the horrors of war and cannot begin to imagine the effects of today on today's world. And so I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity. It's really been a privilege. Thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions. I love questions, yes. Here.
There it's on. Bill?
When did you get the word that the war was over, and what was that like for you? What did you hear it on the radio? Did somebody come through in the newspaper? How was it?
Do you know? I don't remember.
Really?
No. I just knew it was over.
Barbara, there have been some social scientists who have been interested in the question of the effects of the later life effects on people of having experienced the Depression. And they have particularly studied children and asked the question, what was life like for these kids 40 years later? And one of the major findings is, and this is a little rough, the major finding is that kids who were 15 and over during the Depression were very different 40 years later than children who were 6, 7. And I could see that in my own life because I was 6 and 7 at the time of the Depression, and my brother was 11 years older than I was. And later in life, I could see that he was very different in certain respects than I was, partly because I think he understood what was going on, and I didn't. I mean, I lived through it. I had the experience. Do you think there's anything comparable to that in the Second World War?
No question about it. In fact, you remind me to add to this. I grew up knowing that there may not be a tomorrow.
Oh my.
And in the end, that was my survival tool. There were many things that were incredibly difficult and almost insurmountable that happened with a broken family, my mother's condition, all kinds of things. There was no hope in England. And I just have a sense that intuitively I had this sense that having survived that, I could survive.
There was after the war, one of my regrets about our policies after the war was that we didn't include England in the Marshall Plan. We helped our conquered but not our fellow victors. There was a terrible era of rationing, was there not, that you haven't touched upon? The years after the war were economically extremely difficult, I think.
And potential. I mean, my peers, my friends who survived also went on to find a future in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America. There was nothing in England. And I will give you what the English say of themselves about the Marshall Plan is that the diplomats at the time were playing, but we owe it to you.
You owe it to us.
We owed it to the people we had destroyed.
Yes, that's true, but the damage to England, we needed to help with the rebuilding of London and other sites.
Barbara, Could you speak about your book collection over on this table and
Oh.
describe it a bit?
I have some books.
That's the perfect description. What more could we want?
And I really encourage you to just browse there, because you will see the things that we lived with, the shelters, the destruction, the spirit. I mean, the English are pretty crazy for reason, but it's not the first time that someone has tried to conquer us. They tried. The Romans tried it. Look what it did for them. Oh, and I also, yes,
Yeah.
I also have a copy
Yeah,
of my own
that's-
book, which
you
is
know that one.
the series of my life. You might be interested in that.
One
Yeah.
of the ones I find all of them are amazing. Evacuation in wartime Britain from 39 to 45. Look at the picture on the front, the train with the little people looking out the windows.
Yeah,
It is-
Read the titles. Give the
Read
titles.
the titles, that might be helpful.
Just to give you an
Now,
idea.
tell us a little bit about the pocketbook. What is that?
No, take the real books.
Ignore those?
Yeah.
Oh, I love clear directions. I love dog commands. Okay, the Children's War. The People's War, Britain, 1939 to 45.
That's a magnificent book. That's got a lot of
August
information.
Calder, the author, Calder, and Blitz, A Pictorial History of Britain Under Attack, No Time to Wave Goodbye, The Wicked Wit of Winston Churchill. That's a must-read. What's this big one, Barbara? Reader's Digest. Yesterday's Britain, the illustrator's short story of how we lived, worked, and played. It's just an amazing collection, Barbara, and these are all yours.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing that might be interesting for you, England is very tiny. Churchill only lived 15 miles from where my home was, and he would, on his way to London, sometimes they would come through the village. And many times I saw General de Gaulle walking past my house. He was in, what do you call it? He had self-exiled and had chosen Pet's Wood to live. So he was a very tall man.
Any question?
Thank you, Garth, for commenting on you're not paying
There.
for America not paying to the Marshall Plan. But I would like to make comment on this. I am 10 years younger than Barbara, but I was born in 1939 in January, and war broke out in September. But I want to say that during the war in Britain, the government was a coalition government. Churchill headed the government as Prime Minister. But when the war ended, the coalition government ended, and the Labour Party was brought into power. And what the Labour Party did, almost immediately, they threw money at the general education plan in Britain. And this was an incredible move. This is when, in England, and this was for the general public. This is not the private school system. This is the general public system. And it was their intent to absolutely raise all the general public of Britain, raise that educational standard to the skies. And it was then that we got nursery schools coming in at 4 years old. It was then that the 11+ exam was introduced. It was then that the O and A levels in grammar school came about, and the university system was totally ramped up.
I'd also like to add that at this point also, the war broke the class system, where
Yes.
the butcher, the baker, had sometimes become a general or a colonel. The lords and the viscounts sometimes were just privates. And it was a great leveling of the social structure. And I think that the Conservative government would have been challenged by the Labour government was the leveling of society at last.
Well, this,
To amplify what you said, a book that has affected me deeply is called Children of War. And it was written by a woman several decades after the war, but she put a sign in all the post offices. If you were a child during World War II, would you send me what you remember? And she compiled this enormous amount of material. And it talks about the breaking down of the caste system, as you said. It talks about the children in London that were evacuated. It talks about the rationing, and if there was going to be a wedding or a special occasion in a neighborhood, the women would hoard their eggs and butter so that they could have a celebration. It talked about a bomb in someone's backyard and everyone flocked to help. And I cannot think of the author, but Children of War has affected me a great deal, as has your story. Thank you, Bev.
Grant.
Let's see. Are we headed here?
Oh, I don't know if I can.
Again?
Oh, I'm just reminded, re the class system, the story of the man who went to the loo at the end of the train carriage and noted that signed gentleman raised the seat and muttered, "Another class distinction."
Barbara,
Yes.
thank you for sharing. This is not easy. Going back to one's childhood and reliving truly traumatic incidents and periods of time, the disruption of a family life, and on and on. My question is, in Europe at that time, this is where I lived, in Nazi Germany, there was absolutely no trust in each other. So whether you were German and you had a German neighbor, you didn't know how they felt about anything. So there was tremendous tension. Was there anything like it in England? Because in America, we did not enter the United States did not enter the war until much too late, basically. For one reason was that the Congress was very much against it because society was divided.
Ina, it's a really good question, but it's something that I learned when I lived in France among a lot of stateless people. We never lost our country. I never lost who my roots are. That is huge.
Thank you. Thank you for recognizing that.
Yeah.
Yes, I found a very similar type of story that my wife told me about things happening in Glasgow, Scotland,
Yeah,
which happens to be a major shipbuilding area,
right.
about finding bombs in the neighborhood, rationing, trying to save up for a special occasion, as you mentioned.
It was stark.
So,
It was stark.
yes, there was a bomb in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So they were talking about that, and she was also sent out to the farm country as a very young girl. So I found a lot of things similar to her experience in years.
I think it's my turn. I just would like to add, I agree with Barbara. I've never lost touch with my feeling for England. And I was brought up, I'm a little younger, and I was brought up in Liverpool mostly all the time during the war. And we experienced air raids, rushing into a closet where we could close the door. I lived with aunties in a flat right near to the city of Liverpool, which was a big target because of Camel Laird, the shipbuilders, and of course it was a port.
Yeah.
And we did have a direct bombing one night across the street, but we survived. I lived with my aunties, and my parents moved to a horrible little town called Crewe. And Crewe was a junction, if you were going east or west, or north to south by train, you changed trains in Crewe. And my dad was given a very good job at Rolls-Royce, which was a shadow factory. And so I did go to visit them once from Liverpool, and I remember the air raid shelter outside where they lived. It was a brick building, small, and we took our blankets and pillows at night, and if you were lucky, it wasn't hit by a bomb.
Right.
And then the only time I was sent away from Liverpool briefly was to stay with my auntie in a little village outside Birmingham called Barnt Green. And my auntie's, her husband was Italian, so he was interred during the war. And she, from her bedroom, upstairs had a balcony, and we used to stand in the dark in the balcony and watch the incendiary bombs drop. And the next day the bomb squad would come, because you could be in a field and put your foot on an incendiary bomb that hadn't exploded. But so my wartime was really spent in Liverpool, and we all survived. It wasn't easy, but
And it was bleak.
it was bleak, but I was a little bit younger, and I agree, if you're a little bit younger, I didn't quite understand what it was all about till I went to my auntie's in outside Birmingham and went to school there, and I felt very much an outsider because I was from Liverpool. So that's my experience of the
Thank
war.
you.
Thank you, Barbara, very much. I just wanted to point out that Barbara's own autobiography is an excellent book. If you enjoyed her talking about the war, you can enjoy her talking about the rest of her life, and that is in the library. And the title is Don't Push the River. I don't quite understand why that was the title, but you'll find out, no doubt. I was evacuated with my mother and two sisters to Canada during the war, so I didn't live through the experiences of wartime, but I got back before the end of the war, and doodlebugs landed very close to where I lived. And of course there was still rationing for a long time.
Well, doodlebugs. Don't push the river really and truly is my metaphor, because I found that if I stood and tried to block my way, I couldn't move forward. But I think it's a Buddhist thought.
So I was going to add something about the rationing. My father was in the Army, in the parachute regiment that dropped in Holland.
Ooh.
And was wounded the same day he dropped on the 17th September of 44. And he had a hospital visitor while he was in Holland, who then later married someone, a British officer, an engineer, and moved to England. My grandmother corresponded with her. She initiated the correspondence, telling my grandmother that he was okay, despite being wounded. But there's one letter in the collection that we have where my grandmother apparently offered to send clothing, and the woman wrote back that it was in extremely short supply, and my grandmother apparently organized some kind of a drive at their church and everything else and collected clothes and shipped them over, probably about 1947. So it went on for quite some time, and amusingly, the woman, being Dutch, didn't have an English tape measure, and so she didn't know how to take her measurements from my grandmother. So she cut strips of brown butcher paper and wrapped them around herself and marked them with all of her measurements, and they're still in the envelope along with all the other stuff.
Oh, that is glorious. Yes. One more.
It's on. Nancy?
I was born just at the beginning of the war, and when the demobilization came, I lived in outside of Columbus, Ohio, and there were Air Force bases, several all around. And I remember when one day, sitting outside my house, which looked out on the 3C highway, Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. And a whole day, nothing but Army vehicles. It never ended. And I was sitting there all by myself. I was really probably 8 or 9. I don't know.
What year would that have been?
What?
What year would that have been?
I'm not sure. I think, well, it would have been, when did the war end? I don't.
45.
Yeah, and then, but this was later. But being a very small child, all by myself, sitting under a big oak tree, watching an amazing, it never ended. The whole day until I went to bed of demobilization.
Barbara, we should let you go, I think. It was a wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and I want to publicly thank Grant, who provided the energy time after time for this to happen, Grant.
Yeah.
You know, and it came together the right way because of you. Thanks, Grant.
Yeah, thank you
really.
very much. And to that, I will also say that Nancy and Linda had a great deal to back up. And Risa. Thank you, lovely.
Risa and Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure.